Welcome to yet another exciting edition of the Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang, so pleased as always and honored to join one of the most essential constitutional voices in our country. Professor Corey Brettschneider, the man with the PhD in politics from Princeton, the law degree from Stanford, teaching the political science department at Brown, and classing up mainstream media from the New York Times to Politico, CNN to MSNBC. Professor is, of course, the author of The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents, which is not just a civics lesson, but a warning siren for these times. What a pleasure, Corey. It's good to see you again.
Thanks, John. It's always such a pleasure to speak with you. And in the midst of these terrible times, of course, the podcast is about the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. And we have a president who's doing anything but that. He's assaulting the Constitution. And yet, at the same time, I find it hopeful and calming to talk to you every week. So looking forward to this conversation as always. And of course, this week we're joined again by, I think, our first repeat guest, Mike Zamore, National Policy Director for the American Civil Liberties Union. They played a part in organizing the No Kings rallies around the country, really all of the major lawsuits against Trump's abuse of power. So we're lucky to have him as a friend of the podcast and now a regular repeat guest. So really looking forward to this one.
Well, Corey, there's so much we have to get to today. It's been just a little bit eventful. And as you have said many times, this man is not trying to lead a country. This man is shouting fire in a crowded democracy while clutching a tiki torch. But it does appear that the cracks are showing. The public ain't buying it. His immigration numbers are underwater. His approval rating is in the toilet. The only thing holding up his presidency is the trembling spines of the Republican cowards in the Congress. Law firms that bent the knee to this guy that we've talked about are now bleeding clients. The ICE raids are backfiring so hard. Even in red states, the ground is shifting. The MAGA civil war is beginning over Donald Trump and war and Iran. And of course, the tariff disaster has wrecked global trade. Moody's raised the recession odds to 40% because of his policies. It's like watching the Titanic sink, Professor, and the captain demanding a birthday cake on the bow. But this weekend, we saw the two events. We saw the Donald Trump military parade for his birthday, and we saw what some estimates say are the largest single-day demonstrations in American history. I'm really curious of what you thought of the curious juxtaposition, Professor, of Donald Trump making the military shuffle along. They were not marching for him pointedly, versus the No Kings rallies across the country.
What a moment. And I've heard you talk about it as a tale of two protests, and it really couldn't be more different, both in terms of the size and enthusiasm, the small numbers for this birthday celebration, this wannabe North Korea authoritarian rally. People just weren't enthusiastic about it. And as opposed to the No Kings rallies that Mike Zamore and others organized, and I should mention Indivisible and other groups, we're just in a moment where people are starting to wake up to the threat of authoritarianism. And I think they are also waking up, thankfully, to the fact that although we'll talk about lawsuits and courts and slowing things down, look, it's been a mixed record, and it will be a mixed record going forward. They will stop some of the worst abuses, but others, and we'll talk today, for instance, about the momentary pause on the ability of Trump to nationalize California's National Guard, but that might be a loser in terms of democracy. They might bend to authoritarian power. So what is it that really leaves us to defend democracy, to defend the Constitution? It's these rallies, it's the American people, it's the disappointment in a wannabe authoritarian. And, it could have, by the way, the way facts are, we could have been in a world or in a culture, in a society where the rally for authoritarianism that he tried to have on his birthday had millions of people turn out.
Exactly.
But we didn't. And that's where the hope comes from. So the main thing I hear from listeners is, where's the hope? Where's the hope? Well, now we've got a large dose of it with the No Kings rally and the huge turnout around the country.
Yeah, this really was not a battle of crowd sizes this weekend, like the media sells it. This was a clash of values.
Yeah.
And one side was desperate for a spectacle, and the other was building America's future. And Trump tried to use our troops as props to portray strength, and all he really did was expose his weakness. So let's get to it, Corey. You were quoted in the recent New York Times article documenting a staggering list of impeachable offenses committed by Combe over Caligula in just the first 5 months of his second term. It's remarkable. And now that we're watching him, I guess we're back to presidents can unilaterally declare war again, even if some Republicans don't care for it. My God, it's been insane. Corey, can you walk us through what you see as the most urgent constitutional violations and why they matter?
Well, I'm so glad to be talking about impeachment. And of course, this won't really matter unless Democrats take at least the House of Representatives and hopefully both chambers. If it does, then we will have a real, partly strategic question of whether or not to pursue impeachment. But
I'm sorry,
regardless of
Professor. It won't happen unless they take both chambers and have the will to do it. Go ahead, please.
That's right. Yeah. And, well, part of what hopefully will supply is the will to do it, because I think he has committed impeachable offenses. I think this is the bulwark against authoritarianism that the framers envisioned. And we have to at least try to use it, if to do nothing else than to get into the public record the offenses against the Constitution. So let me first just say the idea, because we're maybe out of practice in talking about impeachment. We talked about it twice, of course, during half the impeachments that have ever happened, votes by the full House of Representatives in the last Trump term and Trump 1.0. But the oath, I'll go back to the title of this podcast, which is so unfortunately relevant. The oath in the office, why call it that? Article 2 says that the president is obligated to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And when the framers use the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors, that might sound to most ears like they were saying, okay, if we have a president who commits criminal offenses. That's not what they were talking about. They're talking about there is no category, for instance, in the criminal law of high crimes. If you took a first-year law school class in criminal law, that's not a category. So what were they talking about? And what were they talking about? Misdemeanors. They were talking about demeaning the office, undermining our democracy. So that's what we're looking for. What are the kind of most salient, most offensive when it comes to the Constitution and our democracy things that he's done? And we have a long list. I'll mention two off the bat, and I know there are others that I talk about in the New York Times piece and the Thomas Edsel that he quotes at length from my arguments there.
Mm-hmm.
But the first is the shutdown of dissent. You can't have a democracy in which you're arresting opponents, in which you're really threatening as well to shut down anyone who criticizes you. And the lack of respect for the idea of dissent, I'd put it at the top, because it really is the most direct threat to our democracy. It's hard to rank them. Certainly would mention George Washington talked about the oath of office that I mentioned in his first inaugural, and he talked about the emoluments clauses. We have two, banning profiting from the office. And so the bribe plane and other things that we've talked about have got to be part of it. And then so much else, the attack on the judiciary. And then finally, I'll mention, of course, the ongoing attempt to cover up and aid this insurrection on January 6th, including the pardons.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's go deep on all of this, because from the crypto to January 6th, I mean, we're looking at revoking law firms' clearances and cutting university funds, deploying the Marines to LA, profiting off the office, violating the emoluments clause. But again, I always say they could have impeached him 1 minute into his first inaugural address for that, all while targeting dissenters. In the piece you're quoted in the New York Times, you mentioned that the impeachment would have to be framed in a way that highlights the danger these abuses pose to democracy itself. It's not enough to just say high crimes and misdemeanor. So how, something serious that really hurts democracy, like lying about a blowjob you got from an intern. So how do we cut through the fog of these daily scandals and all the what the F fatigue that pops up to make that threat real for everyday Americans? How do you frame it?
Well, there's during the Nixon impeachment, there was a Republican congressman who gave a phrase that's the subtitle of my book is based on. He said, look, we've got to use impeachment as a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. And also, of course, for the current president, it's especially a guide to his misdeeds. So that's how I'd suggest these things be framed, that there's a danger in terms of either over legalizing all of it, talking about the criminal law, or getting too much into the details. We want to talk about the details of what happened, but we also want to connect the dots. And the way to do that is to appeal to the Constitution. So the First Amendment gives us a right not only to free speech, but to dissent. And so many of the actions that are impeachable can be summed up here. The attacks on the law firms are, I mean, they are barring those who defended the president's opponents from even entering courtrooms. What
That's right.
greater example of the abuse of office can there be? The attack on Harvard University for not being, in his minds, compliant subjects, which is what he wants. He says, of course, he admires the dictator of North Korea. People just obey him. When you defy him, you get all of your funds revoked. All of those go to the idea. And then, of course, the threats to Liz Cheney, Congresswoman Cheney, and others for defying him, the threats to just prosecute them. And when he's asked for what charges, he doesn't feel the need to give charges. It is nothing more than an authoritarian shutdown of dissent. I mentioned the emoluments clauses, and everyone should know those words. It's, maybe not the best term for publicizing his wrongdoing, but it's crucial to know it. It means you can't use the office for profit. And then the idea of due process, the deportations to the gulag in El Salvador that we'll talk about. I mean, there's just so much, but the key, I guess, to come back to my main point, is understand them not as individual crimes, but as collectively assaults on the fundamental features of the Constitution.
Right, they're parts of the menu. I mean, I agree that, with everything you're saying, but yes, being a horrible person who admires awful, murderous dictators and who shovels out empty threats are horrible traits, but they aren't high crimes. They're just shading to all we're seeing. And
Right.
many legal scholars in this article, including you, cite the disregard for due process as being a significant thing one could impeach him for if one wanted to, including sending American citizens to foreign prisons and violating court orders and denying funds without legal proceedings. I mean, I keep thinking, what precedent does that set for future presidents?
Well, if it's very hard to pick the most essential part of democracy, because without the First Amendment right to dissent, we wouldn't have a democracy. Now, due process is a close second. The very idea that you have a right to appear in court, to hear the charges against you, the entitlements of habeas corpus,
Right?
often called the ancient writ, they've just disregarded them. And we've talked so often here about the way that they've, and Mike Zamore said last time, we'll ask him for a follow-up today about where these cases are, but they not only were sending plane loads of people to a foreign gulag, but we didn't know if there were they were claiming they were non-citizens. How do we know that without due process? So that's part of why
Yeah.
standing up and using, yes, impeachment as the way, the vehicle to do this, standing up for due process is so important. And it's not enough to leave it to courts to do it. We've got to do it through this political process that the framers gave us. 50% of the House of Representatives to impeach, 2/3 of the Senate to remove, and then a second vote, 50%, to disqualify him from running for any future office.
I know that, we're nowhere near an actual serious conversation about impeachment, but I'm sorry, friends listening. This is just too damn fun and lovely
Yeah.
and good for the heart. You also, I want to touch on these points briefly, Corey, because you rattled off a lot. You flagged his retaliation against universities and law firms as an attack on free speech. I think you're exactly right. Could that be seen as a systemic violation of the First Amendment by the chief executive?
Well, John, the way you just put it is so important. I'm just going to hold on that. Any one of these things could be dismissed. And, his remarks, for instance, in the first term about there being good people on both sides, if that was just a one-off, if it wasn't in the midst of the assault on civil rights that we'll talk about with Mike Zamore, maybe, okay, he misspoke or something. But I don't think so in the context of his overall record. And certainly that's true of the right to dissent, that when you take any one of these things as individual problems, maybe it's not a high crime, but when you add it up, it certainly is an attempt to shut down dissent entirely. And let's not forget either that as much as we're in the danger and we're flirting with dictatorship, this is a crisis of democracy. We have seen dissent shut down before. In fact, during the John Adams presidency,
Yeah.
more than 126 prosecutions of political opponents. It's a fragile democracy, and that's why impeachment, even if we're not there yet, even if we're a long way off, certainly holding them to account by talking about what is impeachable, I think is important at this moment.
Absolutely. We have to keep on talking about this cryptocurrency empire because clearly there's not just a violation of emoluments clause, but it's bribery. We know it. It's out in the open. I mean, we already legalized bribery with Citizens United, but that's not enough for some people. But Corey, you want to get nuts? Let's get nuts on this impeachment speculation because one of the most fascinating parts of this New York Times article was where you and others said that Trump's pardons of January 6th terrorists, because that's what they are, according to the dictionary, I don't call them insurrectionists, they're terrorists, that this may constitute a whole new impeachable offense, and that the Senate's failure to convict him before does not bar Congress from trying again. Let's remember, the House only adopted one article of impeachment against him in 2021, incitement of insurrection. There were so many more crimes committed that day. Can you explain briefly, and I know this is crazy, but by God, tell us why double jeopardy doesn't apply to impeachment?
Well, one of the problems in thinking about impeachment that not only, really have accompanied the actual attempts of the impeachment is they've gone too legalistic. So, for instance, to go to the 19th century in the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, a white supremacist by his own understanding who tried to bring back slavery under a different name. They were overly careful, and the details of that impeachment are all about something called the Tenure in Office Act and the removal, his firing of a anti-slavery Secretary of War. But they didn't sell it to the American people. They didn't make it broad and they made it sound like a court of law. But when the Constitution says that there's impeachment in the House and a trial by the Senate, it's a trial not in the sense of criminal law, but in the sense of a unique process of thinking about whether or not the office was undermined. And senators take a new oath to transform themselves into this particular body that's meant to defend democracy. Now, the mistake was made there, and there weren't enough votes to remove that president, who obviously did deserve to be removed. And in the case of January 6th, I also think it was too legalistic, and we could broaden it out. Now, one thing that people might say mistakenly is, no, Corey Brettschneider, you can't have this impeachment again for the January 6th crimes because we've already done that and failed. And in a criminal court, that would be true. We have a protection in the Constitution against trying someone twice. It's the bar on what's called double jeopardy. But that doesn't apply in the Senate trial or in the case of an impeachment. The standard of reasonable doubt is criminal. That's not the standard here. It's more like preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not that he did it. And you can do it a second time. And we have so much more evidence and so many more instances beyond just the incitement there. We know he tried to undermine the electoral process. And now we have the pardons, which on their own might not be impeachable, but in the context of the cover-up of the crimes, of trying to, after all, a coup. That is what he tried to do.
Absolutely.
And so, yes, that's on my list, absolutely, of things that we should revisit. And the idea that there weren't enough votes to convict then doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it again if we get to that point.
Well, shucks, Professor, you just melted my jaded heart. Now I kind of hope Trump still is in office by January of 2027. That'd be more fun than President Vance. All right, we have to take a break. I could talk about this for days, Corey. I have so many more questions about the fundamental threats to democracy and how they can be addressed. But there's a lot going on, including its open season for ICE on Democratic politicians who are non-violently representing their constituents in courtrooms or press conferences. And the National Guard in LA. Oh my God, we have much to get to on The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to the Oath in the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang, along with Professor Corey Brettschneider. So last weekend, we saw a California senator thrown to the ground and cuffed by the Gestapo cowards of ICE. By the way, folks, if any of you out there have a person in your life who works for ICE and they wear a mask and they go and attack these people, anyone that you love in your life who works for ICE, stop loving them, please. Stop. No more love. Stop loving the person in your life who puts on a mask to do Gestapo nonsense. Now, Corey, we just saw Brad Lander, mayoral candidate, comptroller of the city of New York, escorting a constituent from a hearing. The case was dismissed, and yet somehow they cuffed this guy as well, coast to coast, just like Trump said. He's not going to go after his friends who employ undocumented workers to avoid paying a living wage to an American worker, but he'll go after Democratic politicians who treat these humans like they're humans. So let me start with this. Under what legal authority can ICE detain or handcuff a public official like the New York City comptroller when he's just observing a court proceeding?
Look, they're going to have all sorts of arguments, and it's not that they don't have lawyers and they don't have things that they'll say. They'll say they didn't need a warrant in a public area. They'll say that he was obstructing their legal arrest of this undocumented person, and that he was interfering essentially with a lawful arrest. Now, they're going to do that in each of these cases. They're claiming that a California senator lunged at the Secretary Noem. They'll claim that in the New Jersey, Newark, and I know we'll talk about this with Mike Zamore too, that in that case, there was unlawful activity that they were restraining. So, we could counter each one of these, and really it's going to come down a lot to the facts of what was happening. Did he really obstruct or not? The fact that they released him so quickly suggests that he didn't. He was asking them questions and asking them for identification. That itself is not obstruction, but they'll claim otherwise. But again, we've got to add it up. It's the same theme as before, that if we just focus and argue and litigate each individual case, then we'll miss the general theme, which is that the ICE is acting as you said, a kind of fascist deportation force. And to go back to our original, the thing I put at the top of the impeachment list, it's part of the system of shutting down an opposition, going after private universities, going after law firms, and certainly the arrest of public officials. As I think I said on the last episode, if this was being covered, from a country, say in Latin America, and there was instability, as there sometimes is, of course, in Latin American countries, we'd be talking about, the opposition is being arrested. And that's what it looks like when it comes down to it, regardless of the details.
Yeah, a reminder to everyone, it is legal to video law enforcement doing their job in all 50 states. Corey, what does this incident tell us about the ever-evolving relationship between federal enforcement agencies and local elected officials, particularly in what we call sanctuary cities?
Well, all of these issues, including, I know we're going to get to the question of nationalizing the Guard, pit two parts of our system against one another. One is national power. There is a federal government, and it's given powers by the Constitution, but we also have a 10th Amendment. And what the 10th Amendment says is those powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states. And so while ICE has certain powers over immigration, they don't take over local law enforcement. Local law enforcement retains powers. And one thing that I haven't seen in this discussion is that there certainly is a right of local police officials and local prosecutors to arrest ICE officials who commit crimes. And I haven't seen enough about that.
Ding, ding, Professor. Thank you.
So, this isn't going away, this tension between the federal and state governments. We do have a system of dual sovereignty, as it's often called. And ICE often has been going way beyond their authority. Localities, for instance, are starting to think about legislation, for instance, that would require them to present ID, that would have them remove their masks. And those things seem very sensible. And if those things become criminalized, well, then we have a real showdown possibly going to happen between the local and federal government. Now, what's scary about that is that it looks unstable. You have, federal officials arresting local officials. We could also have local officials arresting ICE agents. But that instability is better than the acquiescence of just allowing the federal government to have agents that are committing crimes with impunity.
I just want to remind everyone, go watch the HBO series Watchmen to really understand how horrifying it is to have cops wearing masks. Corey, I was so impressed by Lander and by Padilla. When we were talking a few months ago, when Elon Musk and his little incel clown posse were taking over the Treasury, and we saw dozens of Democratic lawmakers outside begging to be let into the Treasury to see what's going on, and there was like this one skinny ginger security dude not letting them in. I recall on the show, I was like, Democrats, it's one guy. There's 400 of you. Push past the security guy. I said at the time, I want to see a Democrat get punched. I want to see someone put their body in the movement, as our friend, the great indigenous activist Simon Moya Smith says. Put your body in the movement. People want to be inspired. We've seen two different lawmakers willing to get cuffed this week. I think that's exactly the kind of hope and the kind of resistance that we're going to need to see from these Democrats. Or having a committee to write an angry letter is also very effective, Leader Schumer. So really quick, I want to turn to California. A federal judge, Stephen Breyer's brother, coincidentally, ruled that Trump's deployment of the Guard to LA violated the 10th Amendment. The president invoked Title 10, which allows deployment if there's an invasion or rebellion. And Judge Breyer said the protests don't meet that threshold. Now, that White House is saying this president has broad authority as a commander-in-chief to override a governor's wishes. This is what this podcast is all about. Where does that power end? And where do states' rights begin when it's not to defend racism? Because that seems to be the only time it comes up.
So many great points on the table. One, I do want to just reply to your great point about putting yourself on the line, your body in the way of tyranny. And, a lot of the discussion about Lander that we just had is, did he act illegally or not, or about any of these instances, including Padilla in his arrest. But one way to see it, too, is even if they didn't comply with the law, that it's certainly a form of civil disobedience that shows fidelity to the more underlying parts of the law, fidelity to our Constitution, for instance. And nowhere is that better exemplified than somebody that we celebrate every year with a national holiday. That was Martin Luther King's Jr.'s most important piece, the letter from a Birmingham jail, about the idea that even if you break a particular law, you're showing fidelity to the deeper one. So I don't want to be too legalistic about all of that discussion. And even if it turns out that the facts turn out that, that Lander was obstructing this ICE agent, he was doing it in a way that showed fidelity to the underlying idea of the Constitution. The other 10th Amendment discussion that we're having, of course, is about the military and the nationalization of the Guard and the back and forth that you mentioned, including Stephen Breyer's brother, Chuck Breyer, who said that it was an illegal takeover. Look, I'm not optimistic about that one. It's not going well. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals is looking at that ruling. And the way the oral argument looked is it looked like they were going to interpret a statute that goes back to 1796 that talks about a president's power in cases of really invasion or insurrection. And yet, although obviously the peaceful protest is not an insurrection, so common sense says, and this was Breyer's point, that he's acting beyond the law. This is an illegal act. This isn't an insurrection or invasion, nothing like it. And the false idea that somehow there's an invasion going on by undocumented people isn't borne out by the facts at all or common sense. But here's the reality. This panel seems to be saying, we're going to leave it up to the president. So it's not looking good. But yet the people are going to fight back. We're going to talk about that with Mike Zamore. And, as much as we hope the judiciary will back us up, ultimately it's us, the citizenry, that has to stand up to tyranny.
All right, I still have many questions about this, but I'll ask them to Mike Zamore whether he's ready or not. And I just want to also say, as long as we're talking about things that are unjust, they are never going to give a Supreme Court seat to the Breyer brother named Chuck. I'm sorry, you'll never see a guy named Chuck getting on. Stephen, yes, but Chuck, no, we just can't do it. And Your Honor, is that justice? Okay, we got to take a quick break. Back in just a moment with Mike Zamore and more on The Oath in the Office. Welcome back to The Oath in the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, along with Professor Corey Brettschneider. Corey, I'll let you do the honors of reintroducing our special guest.
Great. Thanks so much, John. I'm so honored that Mike Zamore is returning to the podcast. Certainly a friend of mine and a friend of the show, and I hope he'll return many more times. Mike Zamore is the National Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the ACLU. And as our listeners know, this is such a crucial organization when it comes to lawsuits, when it comes to protests, and when it comes to really holding this president to account, as our podcast name suggests, to the oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The ACLU has more than 4 million members. Before he was at the ACLU as National Director of Policy, Mike was on Capitol Hill, and he spent 14 years, actually, as the Chief of Staff to Senator Jeff Merkley from Oregon. We'll draw on his expertise, both in his current role and in his former role. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us again on The Oath in the Office.
Welcome. It's a pleasure to be back.
I guess we'll get right into it. And Mike, let me just start. We were talking about the No Kings rallies throughout the country and the contrast with Trump's wannabe authoritarian birthday rally and just how successful they were and how inspiring. If there's one thing I hear from listeners over and over, it's like, give us hope, give us hope. And I think here I felt helpful. I know you can tell us some about the organizing, the ACLU's role in it, and also were, of course, at one of the rallies. So how did this get going? I mean, people heard at various times about it, but can you give us some of the details of how this brilliant day of protests throughout the country was organized and unfolded?
Yeah, sure. Credit goes, I think, really to Indivisible, and who hatched the idea a couple months back and started planning. And the idea was to do it on Flag Day and do it as sort of counter programming for the military parade for Trump's birthday, to show that there is a brand of patriotism that isn't wrapped up in military hardware and doing whatever the president says he wants in the moment, but that is really around coming together in support of fundamental values that we have historically shared as a country, around equality and opportunity and dignity for everybody. And so the idea was hatched as a follow-on to the very successful hands-off rallies in April. And the idea was, hey, let's give people something to come together around and an opportunity to continue exercising these muscles of mobilization and expression of sort of joyous disagreement with the current policies of the administration.
And of course, no kings. What a brilliant way of framing the anti-tyranny principle at the heart of our Constitution. We were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. earlier, and to my mind, one of the brilliant pieces of political philosophy and rhetoric, if you want to call it that he was able to use was to see how the fight against segregation really went back to the founding principle. And certainly no kings is a brilliant way of putting this anti-authoritarian moment. I mean, Mike, tell us more about what you saw on the ground too, as you were at one of these rallies.
Yeah, I had the privilege of being on the ground working at the rally in Philadelphia, which was one of the flagship rallies. Actually, Dr. King's son, Martin Luther King III, was speaking there. And it was a massive and inspirational showing. People really leaned into the fighting tyrannies in 1776 kind of vibe. Philadelphia is obviously the birthplace of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and people were eager to lean into that history. And I was near the stage area as the march. It started about a mile away at a park and then came up a parkway to the famous Rocky Steps at the Art Museum,
Yes.
which is where the main stage was. And watching this sea of humanity coming up the parkway, splitting to go around a sort of a traffic circle, and then merging in front of the stage, and the signs and the joy, and a drizzly day did not keep folks away. It was really so much energy around these fundamental values that we're talking about, and some, I think a really strong counterpoint to what was happening in Washington on the same day. And I think the organizers and the ACLU was very involved in both turning people out and helping manage some of the logistics. But also we had a couple speakers on the main stage in Philadelphia who were spectacular. And if I do say so myself, I think that the organizers in lots of places were really blown away by the turnout. I think in Philly, the estimates were 100,000. They were sort of assuming 50 would be a successful day.
That's right.
People just, really, I think, were feeling motivated and wanted to come out and show which side they stand on.
I want to also point out that Pope Leo drew 30,000 people to a sold-out stadium in Chicago, and Donald Trump couldn't pack him in with free ice cream. I mean, I'm sorry, but the man still can't get a decent turnout unless Kid Rock is physically handing out free meth in the parking lot. But I mean, to that point, Mr. Zamore, I thought one of the most striking moments in Judge Chuck Breyer's ruling on the National Guard is when he said, "That's the difference between a constitutional government and King George." And I thought, Breyer's down. He gets it. I mean, what's the significance of that line? Does this reflect a broader pushback against this corrosive executive expanding power? And have we found the right framing? Do we have to go back to 1776 to finally nail it?
I mean, if the shoe fits, I guess. I mean, I will say that I thought the Breyer opinion was really strong. And we've gotten similar rulings in a bunch of other cases as well, where this government is trying to bypass the laws, the Constitution, basic fundamental principles like due process. And the judges continue to say, oh, hell no, like this is a government of laws, not a government of men, as the founders, talked about. Corey, I'm sure, could actually tell you which one it was. But I think that this is a pervasive feeling among everybody who's encountering this administration in lots of domains. And I do think that the idea of someone acting effectively as a monarch, as an authoritarian, as a source of all authority and all law, just runs so antithetical to the way most people in this country think about what America is supposed to be.
Yeah, some folks don't want the rule of law. They want the rule of a guy. Corey?
Absolutely. Mike, I wanted to, with us moving the conversation to Judge Breyer's decision, his great decision, but I also wanted to have been honest with the listeners before he came on and talking about the Court of Appeals oral argument, and that's not looking so great, as you know. And there's a good possibility that as profound as Judge Breyer's ruling was, saying that, by the way, they are looking to a statute that I believe dates to 1796, the Trump administration, to claim that we're facing a kind of invasion and even an insurrection. And what they mean by that, and they've said this in a number of different suits, including in the rhetoric around the withdrawal of the right to birthright citizenship, that undocumented people are engaged in an invasion and even an insurrection, and that's why we have to act. And of course, they're saying that in regard to peaceful protests in California, and Breyer's opinion was common sense. It said, no, that's not true. Now, in the Circuit Court of Appeals, the argument was, well, who decides? And it looks like even this 3-judge panel, and I'm disappointed by the Democratic appointee. There are 2 Trump appointees. I expect this from them, but I'm hoping at least there's some pushback. But the bottom line is, coming away from it, they very well might say, it's not up to us. It's up to a president. It's up to Trump to decide if this is an invasion or an insurrection. So given that, I mean, I welcome your thoughts about how this might go, but also, in looking for the hope, even in the face of this bad news, is there still hope here? Is there something that we can do to push back against this usurpation of the law, the nationalization of the Guard, with what looks like an attempt to shut down dissent?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. I think that you're right about the Breyer decision, and other courts, especially in the cases around the use of the Alien Enemies Act, another 18th century law they've tried to invoke. This is the one they were using to try to send Venezuelans to the torture prison in El Salvador without due process. And we have won, I think, in 4 different district courts, final orders that basically say, in the context of the Alien Enemies Act, like, even if we were to say we're not going to question the factual findings of the administration on their own terms, like what they're describing, even as a fact, doesn't meet the definition of of an invasion, or in the context of the National Guard statute, they talk about an invasion or a rebellion or an inability to execute the laws. And Breyer was saying, like, look, that's not what you're describing. Like, I'm not even questioning whether what you're describing is true. I'm just saying what you are saying is true does not meet this definition. And I think that at the very least, it is clearly the court's job, as several of these judges have said, to decide whether the factual, like, predicates of the statute are being met. Like, the president doesn't just get to say, I conclude that my actions are lawful. The president has to, the administration has to show that the requirements are being met. Now, I think there's another level to this, which is, can you just make up totally BS facts and say, oh, there's an invasion, I used the magic word, and so now therefore nothing is reviewable? I think that the courts should at least be able to, ask the question of, like, come on, is this real? But to date, they haven't even had to strike this stuff down.
Well, yeah, because I mean, this could set a precedent. Tell me if I'm wrong, where any future chief executive on the left or the right could claim whatever vague threats to justify domestic military action. I mean, I'd like to ask you both that right now the Marines are being trained in civil disturbance response. I'd like to ask, how concerning is this for you, gentlemen, from a civil liberties standpoint? I mean, what are the risks of normalizing military involvement in domestic protest response?
Corey?
Well, I mean, I'd say, look, the principle that we thought we had, and that's the reality of where we are, was that military isn't to be deployed domestically. And there is a 19th century act that Mike and the ACLU know this very well, the Posse Comitatus Act, that prevents the use of the military domestically. And yet there are these exceptions. And one that we've talked about is the Insurrection Act. And yet there's this other one now, it turns out, too, the 1796 statute that they're using. But what's at stake is nothing less, John, to go to your point, than the whole idea of having a democracy is that we don't have military rule. That's part of the idea of no kings. And yet here we are talking about the possibility that there might be 2 statutes that really undermine that. And then just to reiterate Mike's point, we really can't stress it enough, those statutes have limits in them. But if judges aren't willing to second guess presidents and say, well, are you actually doing something that's consistent with the statute? Is there really, for instance, an invasion or an insurrection, which is what these statutes contemplate? If they don't do that, if they don't do their jobs, well, then they cede control over to the president. And really, I can't say this enough. We are facing the danger of a self-coup, the takeover of the other branches, including the judiciary, by the president. And the military is a huge part of that. And that's why this is so dangerous. So Mike and I are trained in law. We talk about the law, and the law seems to say, well, there's protection within these laws that might enable a president. But yet if the judges aren't willing to do their job, then that's a real problem when it comes to control over the military by civilians. The principle of democracy, as important as the right to dissent itself. So Mike, I mean, what are you optimistic in the end? Of course, I want to ask you about some of these other cases and follow up. But are you optimistic that the courts in the end will do the right thing here and give control back to the governor of California, or are you skeptical, or hard to say?
I do not get into the judicial prognostication business. So I will say I'm not gonna engage that question directly, but I'll say what I am optimistic about, which is that the use of the National Guard or the Marines over the objection of the governor is double-edged sword when it comes to the administration's efforts to quell dissent. Because first of all, it's just important for everybody to understand, and your listeners to know, that if the military or the National Guard is utilized in a sort of policing role under one of these exceptions, they are still bound by all of the same constitutional restrictions on how they engage with the population as the regular police. You have all your rights still apply. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, the National Guard was called out on the weekend before the No Kings. There were at that point 1,400 rallies or so planned. By the following weekend, when they occurred, there were 2,100 rallies in this country. So it was a 50% increase after they brought the military into the streets of Los Angeles in this show of force. So I think it's really important to recognize that if the administration's goal is to scare everyone so they shut up, it was not working.
Yeah, what a great point.
Yeah.
And we were, in looking for the hope, and I was hoping you were gonna turn to this, that regardless of what the courts do, and you've outlined very clearly what they should do, and I couldn't agree more, but say they fail us, it is up to citizens to defend our own rights. And one worry is, well, we'll just acquiesce. If the courts don't defend us, if the president has the power, then we'll all attend the military parade and salute Donald Trump and act like Trump wants us to act, subjects rather than citizens. And your point, Mike, couldn't be better, which is, no, actually, it's the use of the military in this way that has given citizens their alarm bells, that's activated their historic sense that the rule of law is part of our system, not the rule of dictators. So absolutely, in pushing back. I mean, on that theme, I want to ask you, last time you were with us, we talked about two cases. One was the arrest of a leader of a protest movement at Columbia University, Khalil. And I've been trying to read the tea leaves on this district court judge's opinion there. And just to remind listeners, the administration seems to be claiming that really, if you're a non-citizen, the First Amendment doesn't apply. The First Amendment, as our listeners know, says that there's a limit on what Congress can do, and Congress can't abridge the right to free speech. It doesn't mention citizens in the First Amendment, and that's not its meaning. It's about a limit on government. And yet the Trump administration is taking a very different position. They seem to be admitting that they're shutting down Khalil because exactly of his First Amendment activity. So we have a judge, who said I guess, to my mind, he seems certainly skeptical at minimum of that argument, to reject it. And yet, tell us where we are with the Khalil case.
Yeah, so Mahmoud Khalil has been, effectively a political prisoner because of his speech now for over 3 months. He missed the birth of his firstborn. He missed his first Father's Day, although he recorded or wrote a really powerful note to his son that we released with some celebrities reading just last weekend.
It was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really powerful, and it's I think a testament to how meaningful it can be for one person to raise their voice in the right circumstances. But the posture of this case is that, the government has been trying to keep him detained since March, in Louisiana as far as possible from his home, his wife, his newborn son, his legal team, his base of support. Worth reminding everybody, he is a lawful permanent resident. He has a green card. His wife is a citizen. His son is obviously a citizen as well.
Yep.
And so we had a hearing, a decision last week from the district court judge, as you're noting, Corey, that basically said that he cannot be detained, should not be detained on the basis that the government was asserting, which is essentially this, Marco Rubio, as the Secretary of State, says foreign policy interests, so therefore you're deportable. And we talked last time about the origin stories of that law and what it was really intended for, and certainly was not intended as a tool to quash, speech you don't like happening here in the United States. But they've pursued that anyway, and the judge basically smacked that down and said that's not grounds to hold him. The government then came back and said, well, actually, we're holding him because there were mistakes on his lawful permanent resident application, his green card application. In the decision, the judge had kind of previewed this argument. They didn't actually make it, hadn't made it, but he was like, the judge actually addressed it and said, it is overwhelmingly likely that the petitioner would not have been detained solely on the lawful permanent resident application charge. However, the administration then turned around and said, don't let him go because we are actually holding him on that basis. And the court is now saying, well, then we have to go through the legal procedures and process to evaluate that claim, and including a bail hearing in immigration court first, which is a separate parallel process. So long story short is he is still locked up. And even though the administration is now saying that that's not his speech is not the basis for it, obviously that's a specious argument.
And can you just say more about that? Why? I mean, I could imagine some listeners, and in fact, I talked to someone who knows this judge from law school, and he was pushing back against me with exactly that point to say, look, no question, all the things you've been saying on the podcast are correct about the fact that the First Amendment applies to citizens and non-citizens, and they can't use that as a basis. But this judge was very careful and found a mistake in the application or possibly an intentional error. And so maybe he shouldn't be released. So you said that's not a good argument. So I'm just interested in what the response is so that I can share it with my friend. Maybe he's listening.
Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of technical violations of various, laws and procedures that people or organizations may engage in that are either, not addressed by the government because they're kind of de minimis, or they're addressed in a certain way. And the government can be punished, can be pursuing a technically accurate, path, and also be punishing speech if they are sort of throwing the book at someone for something that the book is never thrown for, And I think that's essentially what is happening here, right? Like, he is a lawful permanent resident with an American wife and son. He is not a flight risk. They have not accused him of any criminal wrongdoing because he has not committed any criminal wrongdoing. And so there's no reason to detain him for a years old error on an application, whether or not that error was inadvertent or not, right?
And is one way to put it
on the pretext, basically.
Right, exactly. So that last word, I guess I was going to say, is another way to put it. And it sounds like the answer is yes. That they might, this might be true that he made the mistake, but it's still an attempt to shut down his First Amendment rights. Why are they doing this? The motive is anti-speech.
And I'll just to get on the record, I don't think that he or our team would concede that there were errors on that.
I see.
They are asserting that there are errors, but so I just want to get that out.
I'd like to just point out that they only resorted to shutting down his free speech, looking at you, Rubio, because they realized, the guy never actually broke any laws and never did anything anti-Semitic.
Right. To the contrary, right? Like during those protests, he chastised people publicly for anti-Semitism.
Right. Tell us about Mike going to the other huge case that we've been covering. And, I was making the case earlier in the podcast that when it comes to, if we ever get to the point of the Democratic Party controlling Congress, and we're talking about impeachment again, that one to my mind, serious issue of impeachment is the shutdown of due process. the deportation without any court hearings of what they allege are non-citizens. But as you said last time on the podcast, we don't know who's on these planes to Gulag in El Salvador, and the defiance of a judge saying, turn back the planes. You were visiting us soon after. They were told very clearly, the administration, to turn those planes back. They refused to do so. They defied that court order. Of course, there's a possibility of contempt hearings still in the air there. But just tell us, I mean, where are we with this horrific, to call it a violation of due process doesn't quite capture it, this undermining of our basic rights under our Constitution?
Yeah, it is an ongoing saga on this case, and there's a lot of moving pieces. And so without getting into all of the nitty gritty, the case has been unspooling in lots of different places because of the requirements that the Supreme Court put on how this litigation would proceed. So there have been now 4 different courts, 4 different parts of the country that have basically said, you can't do this. You cannot use the Alien Enemies Act to deport people. All these same courts have and others have said, if you could use this, you would have to give reasonable process to the accused. And like, this is, the fundamental idea of due process, right, is that if you're going to have government of, by, and for the people, the government's got to assert its authority based on the law and on proof. They can't just willy-nilly exercise their power against people they don't like. So, so that's every court has said, hey, you got to give them due process, including the Supreme Court in first a unanimous decision and then reiterated in a 7-2 decision that we had to go in the middle of the night to the Supreme Court for an emergency order, because despite the previous orders and all these other courts saying you got to give due process, the administration continues to try to resist that requirement. So they were putting people on buses in Texas to go to the airport to send them to El Salvador, having given them 1 hour's notice, I put in air quotes, of a piece of paper written in English. This is to a bunch of Venezuelans. And so we raced to the courts, and the Supreme Court ultimately was like, basically like smackdown of the administration, and says you got to give constitutionally adequate, opportunities here to challenge the thing that's happening to you. So where that case now stands is the Supreme Court remanded it to the Fifth Circuit. So the Fifth Circuit now is going to be hearing the argument on the merits, basically the can you use the Alien Enemies Act question, and if necessary, also the what kind of process is the minimum that's required question. And then presumably, despite whatever happens in the Fifth Circuit, and that oral argument is scheduled for the end of this month, it will go back to the Supreme Court at some point.
I'd like to ask you both, though. I mean, I'm very happy that Kilmar Garcia has been returned to the U.S., and most people say, yeah, go ahead, and if he broke the law, put him on trial. That's due process. That's what people were asking for. They seem to act like it's a flex that we're bringing him back, but we're putting him on trial. Well, that's the American way. But gentlemen, what does it say about us that our Attorney General was finally forced, after months and a 9-0 Supreme Court, our Attorney General was publicly forced to comply with the law?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me, John, as a hopeful moment. And exactly as you say, the rule of law doesn't mean nobody's ever detained for any reason. It means that you have rights to appear in court. And that's exactly what Mike was saying. Yeah. And Mike, I want to throw it to you too, but I also just want to make sure that listeners caught, the detail that's involved in this litigation. When people, I think want to know who's pushing back, how does it happen? How do we get these decisions? It's organizations who said, we, of course, referring to the ACLU, in the middle of the night, pursuing these court orders, recognizing when the administration is acting, monitoring them. And there's a reason you have 4 million members who are looking to you for leadership at this moment. It's because you're doing that work. So I just had to sort of catch that. It's easy for listeners to hear this and think this is that happened. No, it's that there's an active team looking out for the violation of our rights. And John, as you say, the fact that Garcia has been returned isn't a loss at all. It's a way of demanding that the administration put up and show, well, if you claim he's committed a crime, let's see what that is. So Mike, let me throw that back to you. I mean, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, first, I would just say that our litigators are heroic. They are doing amazing work, as are, so many organizers and campaigners and ordinary people who are engaging in things like the No Kings, but so many other things. And, there's a role for everybody to play here in standing up for our rights and our freedoms and our values. Anybody can go to aclu.org/action and find ways to engage. We've got, sort of frequent flyers who are like baked into how we do our work, engaging Congress, engaging state lawmakers and attorneys general, mobilizing the public. And we've got people who come and just like, drop in and do one thing that they're passionate about because they see it on social media. But there's like,
Yeah.
And then obviously like there's the ACLU, and then there's like dozens or hundreds of other ways for people to plug in. But, I do take a lot of pride in working for an organization that is doing such important legal work. And I also want to just make sure that folks recognize that this is a team sport that we all need to be involved in. And there's lots and lots of ways that we all can go about standing up against these encroachments in our own ways, in our own lives.
As long as you said that, Mike, how can our listeners help the ACLU and get involved beyond their computer keyboards?
Well, I think, I would start with the keyboard, go to aclu.org/action. There's lots of ways, IRL, as they say, and online to help out. We've got some folks today on Capitol Hill visiting lawmakers around to push back on Medicaid cuts in this massive budget bill that would shred coverage for lots of folks with disabilities and others. We've got people who are turning out for actions right now in Washington, D.C. and New York City this afternoon in response to the decision the Supreme Court put out this morning that allows Tennessee to ban certain healthcare procedures for trans kids, even though they are completely allowable for kids who are cisgendered. There's ways to get involved in kind of protest and mobilization efforts and lobbying efforts. And there's obviously we're constantly trying to make sure that various policymakers hear from supporters of freedom and justice and opportunity and equality. So
thank you for it
too. Yeah.
Well, Mike, let me just say it's been such a pleasure having you back, our first repeat guest. And of course, we're going to get you on again. There's a lot more to talk about the ACLU, and you are involved in a number of other cases. I'm eager to talk next time, too, about your protection even more of gay and transgender people, a big part of your work. But for now, I'll just say until next time, thanks so much for joining us, and most importantly, for all the amazing work that the ACLU is doing and trying to make sure that we have a system that continues to celebrate the principle of no kings. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for what you're doing. I want to make sure I get my card punched because I know that the 10th visit to the podcast, I get something free.
That's true.
And love what you all are doing, and appreciate you and your listeners being part of this big effort.
Thank you.